Okay, hello and welcome back. WordPress SEO, this is the Yoast plugin. If you're using a different SEO plugin, the settings will be similar, but Yoast is the one I get on well with. It's well received and it seems to work quite well. Right, this is the default that it gives. If you wanted to go back to the default for any reason, you'd click the Reset Default Settings button, but you're probably not going to do that. I've allowed tracking of anonymous data. I'm happy enough with the guy that does the plugin. I haven't donated, but you can do. He's quite happy, obviously, if you do. By default, it leaves the advanced part of the meta box. Whatever, again, defaults are good. If you're on Google Webmaster Tools or Bing Webmaster Tools, or you've got an Alexa identification ID, put the data in there. What the Alexa identification ID does, if you want your website crawled by Alexa and have rankings and stuff on it, then you need an ID, and you can either upload a file to your website or just fill in that box. So you'd put your IDs in those as appropriate. Titles and meta descriptions. I tend to tick force title rewrites, even though it says you don't necessarily need to do that. What that does is if you use a separate title on Yoast, which I suggest you do, it'll just make sure that happens. The meta settings, no index subpages of archives, go for that. Use the meta keywords tool, no. Use the no ADP, no. And no wider. Right, meta keywords tag pretty much is obsolete. It was around in the early days of the internet, and about 3 minutes after it's invented it got spammed. So pretty much any search engine ignores it completely, so it's not really worth your time putting keywords in. No ODP. Open to directory dmos. If you're lucky enough to get in, tick that box, because otherwise Google and sometimes Bing will override your description with the boring one that the Open Directory Demos puts in. Similarly, if you pay for a Yahoo directory, tick that box, but generally speaking you're not going to need that. Clean up the head. I don't normally tick that, but I've ticked a couple of things, so save settings. You clean up the head. What those will do is just make the code in the header slightly smaller. So there's that bit. Okay, social. Add Facebook Open Graph data is ticked by default. I don't tend to do anything with that, but it could be. So leave that, and if you've got anything to do with Facebook Open Graph, or you even understand what it is, put stuff in. Front page settings, tend not to use. Twitter, if you want to add that, tick it, and if you want your username, put that in there, which will be your Twitter name without the @ sign. I tend to leave all of those as default. XML sitemaps, they're useful because that saves having a separate plugin, and again it's ticked by default. What'll happen is that every time you create a new post, it will amend your sitemap, which is useful because that means the search engine robots stand a better chance of crawling around. I'll typically also tick the ping Yahoo and ping ask, just because you can. It excludes media by default. Normally you'd leave those included, which is what happens if they're not ticked. And it's worth getting rid of categories, tags and format, because they just clutter up the sitemap. So tick those and then go for save settings. Permalinks, we've already set to whatever it was, so don't need to set anything in that. Internal links I don't tend to go to. Enable breadcrumbs. If you want to do what's known as a breadcrumb trail on the site, which is another way of navigating around it, you can. You'll see that a lot on things like Amazon, where it says you're in this category and a subcategory of it or whatever, but for a smallish site, not worth going for and pretty much ignore. RSS, WordPress by default creates an RSS feed. Stands for really simple syndication. You don't need to know much about that. You can add stuff there if you understand what you're doing. I tend to leave it as is. Import and export. If you've got a default Yoast thing, you can do it. Again, I tend not to use it. Edit files will almost certainly be scary, and you wouldn't want to do that. Generally speaking, what the files though are robots text, which is basically line by line that says allow any robot to come in. Don't let it crawl around the CGI bin, don't let it crawl around any of the back-end WordPress stuff or anything else. So the defaults are sensible, leave them as that. htaccess file, scary thing to amend, and if you do, on your own head be it, because if you get it wrong it can mess up your whole site. So that's the Yoast SEO plugin. We'll show you how to use that on Actual Post in another video, but that's it for the default. Not much to change, just a couple of things if that. So, and then that makes your site ready to be search engine optimized. It just puts all the ducks in the right row to be used. So a couple more plugins to talk about, which we'll do in the next video.